Today we will explore what real life was like for students and professors in the first universities of medieval Europe. A world of extreme poverty, brutal violence, lessons in the dark, and graduation ceremonies that could ruin entire families. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. It is 4 o'clock in the morning. The 13th century European winter punishes the narrow streets of Paris with a biting cold, the kind that penetrates the bones and makes the body shiver even under coarse wool blankets. In some corner of a cramped boarding house in the heart of the left bank of the River Seine, a 19-year-old young man wakes up. The room he shares with 2 other boys is little larger than a closet. There is no fireplace, no heating. The only protection against the cold is a straw bed covered by a rustic fabric and perhaps a tattered cloak that has seen better days. He stands up, and his breath condenses in the freezing air, forming small white clouds that dissolve in the dim light. He hasn't eaten since the previous afternoon. His stomach protests, but he knows there will be no meal anytime soon. In less than an hour, he needs to be sitting in a cold and completely dark room, listening to a professor recite, from memory, entire treatises on Aristotelian logic in Latin. No candles. No notebooks. No possibility of writing anything down. This is the daily reality of a student at the University of Paris in the mid-13th century. And this reality, as we will see throughout this narrative, is very far from any romantic image we might have of academic life in the Middle Ages. To understand what it meant to be a student in a medieval university, one must first understand how these institutions arose. European universities were not born from a royal decree. They sprouted organically from the cathedral and monastic schools that had existed since the 6th century. But in the 11th and 12th centuries, cities grew, trade intensified, and a growing hunger for literate professionals emerged. Cathedral schools could no longer keep up with the demand. Brilliant masters attracted students from all over Europe. In Paris, the schools linked to the Cathedral of Notre Dame became prestigious intellectual centers. In Bologna, the study of law magnetized students from across the continent. What occurred was a gradual process by which communities of masters and students organized themselves into corporations. The word universitas itself simply meant guild. The University of Paris was a universitas magistrorum et scholarium, a guild of masters and students. That of Bologna was a guild of students. In Bologna, it was the students who hired and fired professors. In Paris, power was in the hands of the masters. These 2 universities, Bologna and Paris, became the great models that all other subsequent institutions would imitate. Oxford, Cambridge, Salamanca, Montpellier, Prague, Heidelberg, all drank from the source of these 2 archetypes. And around the beginning of the 13th century, the medieval university had already acquired a recognizable form, with faculties, curricula, academic degrees, and a corporate structure that gave it remarkable autonomy in the face of civil and ecclesiastical powers. In 1215, Pope Innocent III, himself a former student of Paris, confirmed the autonomy of the Parisian university. The papal bull guaranteed that the corporation of masters and students would govern itself by its own rules, free from the interference of local authorities and, to a large extent, from ecclesiastical authorities as well. Enrolled students came to be considered clerics, subject to ecclesiastical jurisdiction, not civil jurisdiction. This status brought extraordinary privileges, and, as we shall see, it also brought explosive consequences. But before we get to the conflicts, the brawls, and the blood spilled in the streets, let us return to that freezing dawn in Paris. The young student we left just now, shivering with cold in his miserable room, is now walking through the dark alleys of the city. The sun has not yet risen. The streets are narrow, winding, and unpaved in most sections. Sewage runs in the open. The smell is a mixture of mud, animal waste, and the sweetish odor of decomposing straw. He arrives at the classroom, which is actually little more than an improvised hall, sometimes inside a church, sometimes in a rented space. There, dozens of other young men are already settling onto wooden benches. There is no lighting. The first class of the day, called the Lectio Ordinaria, the ordinary lesson, began at 5 or 6 in the morning, and lasted for 2 full hours. In Paris, deliberately, these morning classes were held in total darkness. No candles were lit. The exact reason for this practice is debated by historians, but the practical effect was unmistakable. Students could not take notes. The professor, a magister, would climb to the pulpit and recite from memory entire texts by Aristotle, Boethius, or Peter Lombard. The master's voice echoed in the dark, and it was up to the student to listen, understand, and retain in memory everything that was said. There was no other option. Books were extremely rare and prohibitively expensive. To grasp this scarcity, one must remember that the movable type printing press would only be invented by Gutenberg in the 15th century. In the 13th century, every book was copied by hand, word for word, on parchment made from tanned sheepskin. The process was so laborious that copying a single volume of the Bible could take an entire year. The cost of a book was astronomical. Records of the time indicate that a Bible could cost the equivalent of 10 talents, a sum that in approximate values would represent thousands of silver coins. The average student owned at most 3 or 4 texts throughout his entire education. Most owned none. Learning was, therefore, almost entirely oral, listening, memorizing, reflecting, and debating. These were the tools of the medieval student. After 2 hours in that darkness, the day has barely begun. In Oxford and Cambridge, no meal was served before 10 o'clock in the morning. This meant that the student endured 4 hours of intense classes, first in the dim light and then in the pale morning light, on an empty stomach. Then around 10 there was a break of approximately 1 hour for the first meal of the day. This meal was frugal: bread, perhaps a little cheese and thin beer. Beer, in fact, was the standard drink of medieval Europe, consumed by everyone from children to the elderly, partly because the water was often unsafe. There are estimates that the average European of the period consumed somewhere around 3 to 4 mugs of beer per day, from childhood. Once this brief meal was over, classes resumed at noon and stretched until 5 in the afternoon. In total, a medieval student faced 8 to 9 hours of classes a day, 6 days a week. Sunday was reserved for religious obligations which, for young men considered clerics, were extensive and non-negotiable. What was taught in these long hours? The curriculum was organized around the 7 liberal arts, divided into 2 groups. The first, called the trivium, comprised grammar, rhetoric, and logic, also called dialectic. The second, called the quadrivium, covered arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These 7 fields of knowledge were considered the indispensable basis of all intellectual training. The trivium taught the student how to think, how to argue, and how to express himself. The quadrivium initiated him into the sciences of numbers, shapes, sounds, and the stars. Everything was taught in Latin, the lingua franca of European scholarship. It did not matter if the student was English, German, Italian, or Scandinavian. Within the walls of the university, everyone spoke, read, and thought in Latin. The dominant teaching method was scholasticism. The master would read an authoritative text, a passage from Aristotle, a chapter from the Sentences of Peter Lombard, or a fragment of Boethius. Then he would offer a commentary, an interpretation, an analysis. The students listened in silence, reflected privately, and then participated in formal debate exercises called disputationes, disputations. In these disputations, the student was obliged to argue both in favor of and against a particular thesis. It was not enough to have an opinion. One had to be able to defend both sides of an issue with equal vigor. This practice, which may seem surprisingly modern, was the heart of medieval education. The scholastics believed that truth emerged from the rigorous confrontation of opposing arguments, and that the ability to analyze a problem from multiple angles was the mark of a truly cultivated mind. Every 2 weeks, the masters assigned the students a specific question, and they spent the following fortnight debating it among themselves, sharpening their arguments and refining their objections. At the end of the period, the master intervened to resolve the controversy, presenting a synthesis of the positions under debate. Exams, when they existed, were exclusively oral. There were no written tests, no essays, no research papers in the sense we know today. The student demonstrated his mastery of the content by publicly defending a position before a panel of masters. If he was unable to sustain his argument under the heavy fire of objections, he failed. These young men who endured grueling days of study, who memorized entire texts in the darkness, and who debated in Latin on an empty stomach, were not all the same. Far from it. The medieval university brought together a remarkable social diversity, albeit exclusively male. Women were completely excluded from university education, an exclusion that would last for centuries. But among the men, there was considerable variety. Sons of aristocrats studied side by side with sons of artisans. Wealthy young men who paid their expenses with ease shared benches with miserable boys who barely had anything to eat. The age of entry also varied. In Paris, it was common for students to arrive at 14 or 15 years old, little more than adolescents. In Bologna, curiously, the profile was quite different. There, where students held the power within the university, the average age was around 30. They were more mature men, many of them already involved in ecclesiastical or legal careers, who sought to deepen their knowledge of law in Bologna. In Paris, the scene was different. The university teemed with hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000 adolescents and young adults newly arrived from all parts of Europe, many of them experiencing for the first time the freedom of being away from their families and the controls of their home communities. It was a volatile mixture. The students were divided into nations, which were groupings based on geographical origin. In Paris there were 4 nations: France, Normandy, Picardy, and England, the latter being later renamed the German nation, that is, Germanic. Despite the names, the recruitment of each nation was much broader than one might suppose. The nation of England and Germany included, in practice, students from Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. These nations were not mere administrative categories. They had real power within the university. Each elected its own representatives, managed its funds, organized its parties, and frequently clashed with the others. Tensions between the nations were constant and at times violent. Ethnic stereotypes proliferated. Jacques de Vitry, a cleric and historian who studied in Paris around 1200, left one of the most vivid contemporary accounts of this hostility. He recorded that students from different nations exchanged coarse insults with a disconcerting naturalness. The English were called drunkards and accused of having tails, a reference to a medieval superstition that associated the English with tailed creatures. The French were labelled effeminate. The Germans were called furious and obscene. The Lombards were called greedy and cowardly. De Vitry observed, with a dryness that suggests exhaustion in the face of the phenomenon, that words frequently turned into blows. And this observation leads us to an aspect of medieval university life that is perhaps the most surprising to the contemporary eye: the endemic, structural, and often lethal violence that marked the daily life of these academic communities. To understand the extent of this violence, it is necessary to return to that legal peculiarity mentioned earlier. Medieval university students were considered clerics. This classification was not merely symbolic. It conferred upon the students a set of extraordinary legal privileges. They could not be tried by civil courts. They were exempt from local taxes. They answered exclusively to the university authorities, who tended to be lenient with their own members. A student who committed a crime, who got into a fight, who destroyed someone else's property, or who disturbed public order, was tried by an ecclesiastical court linked to the university, not by the city's common justice. The penalties imposed by these ecclesiastical courts were, in most cases, mild: a verbal reprimand, a symbolic fine, a religious penance, rarely anything more severe. Now imagine the effect of this impunity on hundreds of young men, many of them teenagers, living far from home for the first time, consuming generous amounts of beer and wine, and knowing that, whatever happens, the city's justice cannot touch them. The result was predictable and explosive. The residents of the university towns, who saw these privileged young men destroying property, starting tavern brawls, harassing women, and flouting local laws without suffering consequences, accumulated a deep and growing resentment. Medieval cities were not large. Oxford in the 13th century had perhaps 10,000 inhabitants. Cambridge was even smaller. Paris was the largest city in Western Europe, with about 200,000 inhabitants. But even there, the concentration of students on the left bank of the Seine in the Latin Quarter created a permanent friction zone. Students needed housing, and landlords raised rents. Students needed food, and merchants inflated prices. Students got drunk and caused disturbances, and residents had no effective legal recourse. This dynamic, which historians call the town and gown conflict, was a constant in all university cities of medieval Europe. Historical records overflow with violent episodes. In Oxford, between 1297 and 1322, 29 incidents of violence between students and townspeople were documented. We are not talking about minor altercations, shoving in the street, or name-calling in taverns. We are talking about armed confrontations, assaults with bladed weapons, and deaths. In 1248, a Scottish student was murdered by Oxford residents, and King Henry III fined the city authorities. In Paris, the situation was no better. In one extreme case, the Prévôt of Paris, the equivalent of the city's mayor, ordered the hanging of 2 students accused of murder. When the university protested, invoking the ecclesiastical immunity of its members, the Prévôt was forced into an almost unbelievable public humiliation. He had to kiss the lips of the corpses of the hanged students as a sign of repentance. This episode, recorded in documents of the time, illustrates with disturbing clarity how much the power of the medieval university could override civil power. But of all the conflicts between town and university in medieval Europe, none is more famous, more bloody, and more consequential than the St. Scholastica Day riot, which occurred in Oxford on February 10, 1355. What began as a trivial tavern brawl turned, in a matter of hours, into a bloodbath that would last 3 days, and leave marks for nearly 500 years. To tell this story with the care it deserves, we must first understand the context. Oxford, in the mid-14th century, was a city in crisis. The Black Death had devastated England in 1348 and 1349, claiming between a third and a half of the population. Oxford was hit hard. A quarter of the university's professors died. The city's economy, which relied increasingly on the presence of the university, went into decline. The remaining population was impoverished, frightened, and resentful. The privileges granted to the university by the Crown and the Church, which were already a source of irritation before the plague, became unbearable in a setting of misery and death. The Swindlestock Tavern was located in the centre of Oxford, at the corner of what is now known as Carfax, the junction of the city's main thoroughfares. It was a frequent meeting point for students. The owner of the tavern was John de Bereford, who also held the office of Mayor of Oxford. On February 10, 1355, the feast day of St. Scholastica, a group of university students went into the tavern to drink. Among them were Walter de Springerhuis and Roger de Chesterfield, 2 clerics from southwest England. The wine was served by the taverner John de Croydon. The students tasted the wine and complained about its quality. Words became harsh. The taverner responded with what documents of the time describe as stubborn and insolent language. And then, in a gesture that would change the history of Oxford for centuries, one of the students threw a mug of wine in the taverner's face. What followed was a dizzying escalation of violence. The taverner, furious, ran to St. Martin's Church, the town church, and rang the bell, summoning the residents of Oxford to arms. In response, the students ran to the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, the university church, and rang their own bell, calling the scholars to the fight. In a matter of minutes, the streets of Oxford turned into a battlefield. Residents and students faced each other with sticks, stones, knives, and surprisingly bows and arrows. The Chancellor of the university tried to intervene, calling for calm. Arrows were fired in his direction, and he was forced to retreat. The violence continued until nightfall. The next morning, the Mayor of Oxford rode to Woodstock, where King Edward III was staying, to ask for support. The King issued a proclamation ordering that no one should attack the scholars or damage their property, under penalty of forfeiture of goods. But the royal proclamation arrived too late, and its effect was nil. While the mayor was away, about 2,000 men from the countryside around Oxford marched into the city in support of the residents. Chronicles record that they advanced shouting slogans that can be roughly translated as "Kill, kill, slay, slay, havoc, havoc. Smite fast, give good knocks." These armed men invaded student lodgings, academic inns, and study halls. They beat, wounded, and killed students wherever they found them. The violence continued throughout the second day and into the third, until the energy of the rioters finally ran out, and many of them returned to the countryside or their homes. The toll was devastating. 63 members of the academic community were killed. About 30 townspeople also lost their lives. 20 lodgings and student boarding houses were looted and destroyed. The bodies of students were found in the streets and even floating in the River Thames. The city was in ruins. And then came the judgment. And it is in this judgment that the true extent of the power of the medieval university reveals itself with impressive clarity. King Edward III, who needed internal stability while facing the threat of a new war with France, acted quickly. In June 1355, he issued a royal charter that consolidated and expanded the university's rights over the city. The Chancellor of the university received the power to tax the bread and drinks sold in Oxford, the right to inspect weights and measures used in local trade, and authority over various commercial matters in the city and its surroundings. The municipal authorities lost the right to take any legal action in disputes involving students or the university. They were restricted to acting only in cases involving exclusively common citizens. But the most notable punishment was of another nature. Every year on St. Scholastica's Day, the Mayor of Oxford and the municipal officers were obliged to attend St. Mary's Church, the university church, to participate in a mass in memory of the dead students. They had to swear a commitment to respect and defend the privileges of the university, and 63 citizens of the town, one for every dead scholar, had to accompany them, paying a fine of 63 pence, 1 penny for each victim. This annual penance was not a short-lived symbolic gesture. It was repeated year after year, decade after decade, century after century. When the mayor and his officers paraded through the city on their penitential walk to the university church, students would boo them and throw objects. It was a ritualized public humiliation, a demonstration of power that was renewed every February. The tradition persisted for nearly 500 years. It was only in 1825, when the then Mayor Isaac Grubb simply refused to participate in the ceremony, and the university chose not to force the issue, that the ritual was finally abandoned. Nearly half a millennium of annual penance because of a tavern brawl. This fact alone says more about the power of medieval universities than any treatise on institutional history could. The St. Scholastica Day riot was the bloodiest confrontation, but it was not the only episode of violence with profound historical consequences. The very foundation of the University of Cambridge is directly linked to an act of violence. In 1209, a conflict in Oxford resulted in the death of a townswoman, allegedly caused by a student. In retaliation, the residents of Oxford captured 2 students who had nothing to do with the crime and executed them publicly by hanging. This execution provoked an exodus of terrified scholars who fled Oxford in search of a safer place to continue their studies. Some of these scholars settled in the small town of Cambridge, northeast of London, and there founded what would become one of the most prestigious universities in the world. The irony is remarkable. One of the greatest educational institutions in Western history was born as a direct result of a lynching and a desperate flight. But violence, however dramatic and frequent it might be, was not the only challenge medieval students faced. There was another enemy, quieter, more persistent, and more universal: the lack of money. There is a truth that transcends the centuries and connects the students of 1250 to those of today with a straight and unbreakable line. Students are always poor and are always asking their parents for money. We have hundreds of letters that have survived time, written by medieval students to their families, and reading these letters is at the same time moving and amusing. An Italian father, exasperated by his son's incessant requests, wrote that a student's first song is a request for money, and that there will never be a letter that does not ask for coins. This observation, made more than 700 years ago, could have been written yesterday by any parent with a child in university. A typical letter from an Oxford student, dated approximately 1220, perfectly illustrates the tone of these requests. The student writes that the issue of money is a great obstacle to his academic promotion, as 2 months have passed since he spent the last penny sent by his family. He argues that the city is expensive and makes many demands. And then, in a literary flourish that demonstrates both his scholarship and his capacity for rhetorical manipulation, he invokes a classical reference to justify his need. Without Ceres and Bacchus, Apollo grows cold. Ceres was the Roman goddess of grain and harvest, meaning food. Bacchus was the god of wine. Apollo was the god of reason and the arts. The student is saying, with Latin elegance, that without food and wine, the intellect withers. It was a sophisticated argument, but the underlying desperation was genuine. The costs of a medieval university education were, in fact, prohibitive for most families. In Bologna in the 15th century, records indicate that a student's annual expenses, including fees, housing, and food, revolved around 60 florins. To put this value in context, 60 florins represented the entire annual income of a middle-class tailor. A 4-year degree cost between 48 and 64 florins, at a time when a manual laborer earned only 10 florins a year. This means that the complete training of a student was equivalent to 4, 5, or even 6 years of an ordinary worker's salary. It was a massive investment, accessible only to the wealthiest families or those willing to make extraordinary sacrifices. And for the poorest students, life was a daily struggle for survival. A letter from a student in Bologna describes with painful frankness how he walked from door to door through terrible mud begging for help, and returned home with nothing unless the Lord was with him. This image of a young student stuck in the mud of a medieval Italian city, knocking on doors, pleading for a plate of food or a few coins, is the exact opposite of the glamorous image sometimes projected onto the academic life of the period. Student housing varied enormously depending on financial status. In the early days of universities, there were no organized lodgings. Students scattered throughout the city, renting rooms wherever they could, without any supervision or control. They lived in boarding houses run by landlords who often exploited them, charging exorbitant rents for tiny, unhealthy rooms. This dispersion was a constant source of trouble, both for the students, who were vulnerable to urban violence, and for the residents who had to live with turbulent and unpredictable neighbors. Starting in the 13th century, supervised residences called bursae or colleges were established to house students under the watch of resident masters. Each college had a specific purpose, often aimed at students of the same nationality. In Paris, the most famous of all, the College of Sorbonne, was founded by Robert de Sorbonne around 1257. There were Danish, Swedish, Scottish, German, and Lombard colleges. In these colleges, costs varied according to the student's financial capacity. The wealthiest could pay up to 10 guilders a year. The poorest paid 2 guilders or were completely exempted. The truly destitute lived in student hospices, the medieval equivalent of charity houses, where they received food and shelter in exchange for services. Many of these poor students worked as servants for wealthier peers, copied manuscripts for booksellers, sang in church choirs, or simply begged in the streets. Student poverty was not an exception. It was the norm for a significant portion of the university population. The church played a fundamental role in financing. Many bishops sponsored promising young men from their dioceses in exchange for a commitment that they would return to serve as priests or administrators. But this funding covered, at best, half of the students. Despite all these difficulties, despite the cold, hunger, poverty, and violence, there was something that impelled these young people to persist. There was something in the medieval university that justified the sacrifice. And that something had to do with what happened inside the classrooms, in the debate halls, in the moments when a young mind opened to ideas it had never conceived before. The medieval university, with all its flaws and brutalities, was a machine of intellectual transformation unprecedented in Western history. The trivium and the quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts, were not just a curriculum, they were a worldview. Grammar taught the nature of language as an instrument of thought. Rhetoric revealed the power of the word as a tool of persuasion. Logic, based on the texts of Aristotle, taught the laws of valid reasoning and the discipline of thinking with rigor. In the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy opened the student's eyes to the hidden patterns of the universe. After completing the study of the liberal arts, the student could proceed to one of the higher faculties: theology, law, or medicine, each with its own centers of excellence and its authoritative texts. The great masters of these universities were figures of extraordinary intellectual stature. In Paris in the 13th century, men like Alexander of Hales, Saint Bonaventure, Albertus Magnus, and Thomas Aquinas taught, the latter considered by many the greatest philosopher and theologian of the Middle Ages. These masters attracted students from all over Europe, and the fame of their classes was such that young people undertook journeys of weeks or months, crossing mountains, rivers, and borders, just for the privilege of hearing their lectures. The medieval university created, for the first time in European history, a genuinely international intellectual community. An English student could study in Paris, then in Bologna, then in Montpellier, and in each of these cities he would find colleagues coming from dozens of different regions, all united by the common language of Latin and the common pursuit of knowledge. This academic mobility was possible thanks to the ius ubique docendi, the right to teach everywhere, consolidated by the papal bull of 1233. Any recognized master could teach at any university in Christendom without additional exams. This principle transformed the university into a continental network of knowledge. By the end of the 13th century, nearly half of the highest positions in the church were held by graduates. The university was a machine for training cadres and, by extension, a tool for social mobility. But there was one final obstacle, a last filter that separated those who completed the academic journey from those who fell by the wayside. And this obstacle was not intellectual, it was financial. We come now to what is perhaps the most paradoxical and revealing aspect of the medieval university, the graduation ceremony. For the degree of Bachelor of the Liberal Arts, the requirement was relatively modest. The student needed to have attended classes for a period of 3 to 4 years and swear under oath that he had attended the required lectures. There were no formal written exams. The student's oath was accepted as sufficient proof of his education. The degree of Master of Arts, however, was more rigorous. It required public disputations, the presentation of lectures before a board of masters, and the demonstration of competence in multiple areas of the curriculum. But the true challenge was not in the academic rigor. It was in what came after, the ceremony of inceptio, the reception of the new master into the guild of professors. The inceptio was not a simple delivery of a diploma. It was a spectacle of proportions that rivaled royal festivities, an event of ostentation and sumptuousness that could last for days and required a colossal financial investment from the new master. The new master was obliged to organize a reception banquet with guest lists that could reach 100 people. The banquet hall was decorated with multicolored banners, gilded columns, and canopies adorned with gold thread. The food was a parade of excesses: wild boar, venison, bear meat, pyramids of seasoned pigeons, swan, rabbit, and varied game. Professional musicians, the minstrels, entertained the guests while couples danced. In Bologna, the tradition included a triumphal procession through the city streets, with the new master carried on the shoulders of his colleagues, preceded by flautists and trumpeters. It was a moment of glory, of celebration, of public recognition, and it was also for most students a financially impossible moment. The costs of an inceptio ceremony could reach 100 or even 200 guilders. To put this value in perspective, a manual laborer earned about 10 guilders a year. The graduation ceremony, therefore, cost the equivalent of 10 or 20 years of an ordinary worker's salary. It was a sum that the vast majority of students simply had no way of gathering, nor did their parents, nor their families, nor the ecclesiastical patrons who might support them. The result of this equation was cruel and predictable. Most medieval students never graduated, not because they failed academically, not because they were unable to overcome the intellectual challenges of the curriculum, but because they did not have the money to pay for the graduation banquet. They completed all the academic requirements, attended all the classes, participated in all the disputations, demonstrated mastery of the content, and then left without a diploma, without formal recognition, without the title that would officially attest to their competence. The medieval university had created a system in which only the rich could officially graduate. Intellectual meritocracy hit the wall of ceremonial plutocracy. A brilliant but poor student could complete all the academic requirements, but without resources for the inceptio, his knowledge remained uncertified. Jacques de Vitry, that same cleric who had so vividly described the ethnic conflicts between student nations, was also not particularly impressed with the spirit that animated the academic life of his time. He wrote that almost all the students did absolutely nothing but learn or hear something new. Some studied merely to acquire knowledge, which is curiosity, others to acquire fame, which is vanity, still others for profit, which is cupidity. It was a biting assessment, perhaps unfair in its generalization, but revealing of a perception that already existed in the 13th century, that academic life was not always motivated by the disinterested pursuit of truth. De Vitry also reserved blunt criticism for the professors, whom he described as swollen with scholarship, who hated each other and competed for students without caring in the least for the welfare of souls. Even 800 years ago, therefore, people already complained about academic politics, professorial vanity and intellectual careerism. And yet, despite everything, these institutions were genuinely revolutionary. They created the first international intellectual community in Europe. They developed the scholastic method of rigorous argumentation. They introduced standards that endure to this day: the degrees of bachelor, master, and doctor, structured curricula, academic freedom, the concept of the university as an autonomous corporation. The very idea that open debate is the best path to truth is a legacy of the scholastic disputationes. The graduation rituals we practice today are direct descendants of medieval rituals. And there is something more. The idea that knowledge is universal, that truth belongs to no nation or social class. This idea was radical in an age of feudalism and rigid hierarchies. The medieval university did not abolish these hierarchies, but by creating a space where intellectual merit counted, it planted a seed that would germinate over the centuries. Daily life in these spaces was hard in a way that is difficult to imagine. Waking up before dawn, studying in the dark, memorizing entire texts without writing them down, living in freezing rooms, dealing with street violence, and, after years of sacrifice, facing the possibility of leaving without a diploma. This was the reality. And yet, these young people persisted. Year after year, thousands of them crossed Europe on foot, faced bandits on the roads, and endured weeks of travel to reach Paris, Bologna, or Oxford, because the university offered something that no other institution could offer: the possibility of transformation, the possibility that a young man would enter as an ignorant boy and leave as a literate man, capable of thinking with rigor, of arguing with eloquence, and of participating in the great intellectual conversations of his time. This promise was powerful enough to justify any sacrifice. Medieval universities were not perfect. They preached the universality of knowledge but excluded women. They promised meritocracy but reserved graduation for the rich. They were human institutions, with all the contradictions that implies. But it was these imperfect institutions that laid the foundations upon which all higher education in the Western world was built. From Paris to Harvard, from Bologna to São Paulo, every university that exists today carries the heritage of those medieval guilds that dared to believe that knowledge could change the world. 800 years later, we still live in this world they helped build. Academic degrees, curricula, debates, graduation ceremonies, all of this has roots in those tumultuous centuries. And perhaps the most lasting lesson these first students left us lies in the simple obstinacy with which they faced adversities that seemed insurmountable. In that refusal to give up, there is something that resonates through the centuries and reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is one of the noblest endeavors of the human spirit. If this narrative awakened in you the curiosity to know more about the unknown aspects of medieval life, if the stories of these students from 800 years ago echoed in some way in your own experience, then consider subscribing to this channel. Just like those medieval youths who traveled long distances to join a community of knowledge, you too can be part of this community. Leave your comment below. Tell us what other aspects of daily life in the Middle Ages you would like to see explored in our next videos. Like this content so that it reaches more people interested in understanding the past that shaped our present. As always, thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video.